Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. In the wake of the 2024 presidential election, people are experiencing a broad range of emotions, from celebratory to disappointment to anxiety and fear. In this episode, I talk with Dr. George Everly, an expert in psychological crises, about psychological first aid and how it can help people move through difficult emotions to process disruptive events. Just a note that if you or someone you know is struggling and could use some support, you can call 988 for immediate emotional support. Let's listen. Dr. George Everly, we're very happy to have you back on the podcast. Just to set the scene a little bit, it is after Election Day. People are experiencing a really broad range of emotions, from celebratory to disappointment to maybe even anxiety and fear. And you have experience working with people on how to process some of these big emotions. So we're going to talk to you today about psychological first aid. So can you first walk us through what is psychological first aid? How do you do it? Who does it? Who's this for? Those kinds of things.
So psychological first aid think of it as a psychological Band-Aid of sorts. So we have physical Band-Aids. Why shouldn't we have psychological Band-Aids? They're not designed to be diagnostic tools or treatments at all, but something to take the sting out of an injury, something to facilitate the healing process to an injury. Well, the analog is physical injuries. Well, how about psychological injuries? And what you may be referring to is the recent events may have caused psychological injuries among some people. So you asked me what psychological first aid is. It's a way of addressing psychological injuries in their acute phase, if you will, when it's stinging, when it hurts sometimes the most, when there is shock, when there is perhaps even disbelief. And what we have developed is a very, very simple, stepwise process by which we train people outside of the mental health industry. In fact, outside of the health industry, we can train virtually any adult to do this, to apply psychological first aid. We even we've partnered with Coursera, and we've put online a asynchronous psychological first aid training program, which takes 3, 4, 5 hours, depending on how quickly you go through it. But it has reached the status of being one of the most viewed online courses in the history of the internet. I don't know whether that's a compliment to the course or a commentary in terms of where our world is going.
So tell us, how do you do psychological first aid? And maybe let's use the election as a framework for this. Where do you start?
But what we've tried to do is boil it down to a very, very simple protocol, stepwise progression, I should say, as you will. And forgive the simplicity of the language, and I don't mean to be infantilizing, but just to make it very simple, we say, well, basically, tell me what happened. What do you see? What is your perception of what happened? It could be an automobile accident. It could be a hurricane. I was just down in South Carolina and North Carolina, for example. In fact, yesterday. Or it could be as critical incidents as beauty. Both reside in the eye of the beholder. You said some people are celebrating. Other people are mourning. So what happened is the first step. Then to use a bit of an alliteration, and I do this, again, not to be infantilizing or dismissive, but it's basically what I used to say to my children when they'd come to me. I'd say, what happened and what hurts? Now, when I say what hurts, what I mean is, how are you reacting to what happened? It could be shock, disbelief. It could be sadness. It could be anxiety. It could be feelings of being out of control, fear. So what happened, what hurts? And Then I'd ask them, how bad is it? In the adult world, what we mean by how bad is it, we're talking about to what degree is this A, disconcerting, but perhaps even more importantly, to what degree is this interfering with your life, the things that you want to do, but perhaps more importantly, the things you need to do. So what happened, what hurts, how bad is it? And what you're doing is your mere presence is validating that whatever they say to you has validity, that we are not dismissing it. We're not saying, oh, you shouldn't be that way, or don't worry about it. All of those things, how many times have those things come out of your mouth and you say, oh my God, what did I just say? So we're listening, we're a compassionate presence, and we're letting people vent in the process of just talking. We've known for decades has been somewhat therapeutic, just the cathartic ventilation. But sometimes, and if you're anything like me, you have this conversation with friends or even family members, and sometimes they're all over the place. They're kind of scattered, and that's okay. We don't expect them to present a coherent presentation of what they're experiencing. So then we have another question that does an amazing job of parsing through all of the calamity and the reactions by saying a simple question like, what's the worst part of this for you right now? So what happened? What hurts? How bad is it? How's it getting in the way of your life? And what's the worst part of it for you? So what that does is it gives us a bit of a focus. It says to us, okay, I've heard what happened. I've heard how it's showing up in this person's life. I have a sense of how bad it is interfering with what they want and need to do and their general happiness, perhaps. But that could be overwhelming to both you and the person telling the story. So we then use this distillation question, which is surprisingly effective. And then you both have an opportunity. Almost invariably, it's at that point, people take a deep sigh, like, okay, now we've got it out on the table. Is it as bad as you thought it was? And even if it's not, where do we go from here? So that's kind of the next step, which is we've described the problem and the worst part of it. Well, where do we go from here? And I have become a huge advocate of not rescuing people. Lindsay, I've been to 39 countries on 6 continents. I've seen literally, I've witnessed firsthand the defining moments of the last 50 years. And one thing I'm convinced of, it is still my opinion, but I am convinced of it, that recovery ultimately must come from within. So the people we work with, we don't rescue them, and I don't think they want to be rescued. They want help in rescuing themselves. So rather than offer these sometimes oversimplified platitudes, it's about asking well-phrased questions. It's about asking questions that empower people. One of my favorite, for example, and timing is everything, and I'm not suggesting that this is a quick fix for a complicated problem. But one of my favorite questions, empowering questions, is, well, this sounds really bad, and you're obviously very distressed. But let me ask you a question. What would you tell me if our roles were reversed? What would you say to me? And you would be surprised how often people pause and you see them move, Lindsay, from victim to survivor. And it's breathtaking sometimes. So I don't mean to oversimplify, but that's kind of what we do in psychological first aid.
So what do? You said you've been in a lot of very disruptive, very highly volatile situations. What do you do when the overwhelming feelings are those of despair and a loss of control in situations where people genuinely feel disempowered and like they don't have a voice? When you're talking about huge systems at play, like the election and the electorate, and you're talking about people who feel like their well-being or their very existence might be threatened, how do you ask these questions, or how do these questions lead you to a place of feeling that empowerment?
I think one of the first things we need to do is try to take words like despair, which honestly, I'm a fairly educated guy and I don't know what that word means, in terms of practicality, in terms of helping people. So one of the things I try to do is say, well, what's really going on here? And one of the things that I believe a number of people are going through is loss. They're grieving. So fortunately, we have a number of models of loss, of grief, that can give us some guidance. Not everybody follows it, but it's a basic model or heuristic we can play with. So all of a sudden, if I reframe election, forget election, if I say you've experienced a loss, and the person looks at me and says, oh, well, what's that likely to feel like? Well, you're in shock and denial first. And then you get really angry. And some people get stuck there. But what we'd like to do is help you move on to the next stages. And what are the next stages? The next stages for me, especially as I apply this model to disasters, which I've seen, would be accepting that, okay, it happened. I didn't want it to happen, but it happened. Acceptance does not mean passive endorsement. Acceptance simply means embracing the reality of what occurred and then deciding what you're going to do with it. So I like to tack on another phase. And I'm a fan of history and even mythology. And I remember the phoenix. And Herodotus described the phoenix a couple of thousand years ago and said every 7 years this bird in the Egyptian desert crashes and burns, my term, not his, and arises from their own ashes. But it was Galen 300 years or so later who said, yes, but wait a minute, the bird arises more beauteous than before. For me, that's bigger, bolder, better, stronger than before. Lindsay, we know that all growth is predicated upon struggle. All growth is predicated upon, in some ways, injury. I don't know whether you go to the gym or not, but if you go to the gym and you lift a weight, guess what? You actually incur micro tears in your muscles, and that is a prerequisite to getting those muscles stronger and growing larger. And we can use that as a metaphor that all positive change, I believe, or at least most of it, I shouldn't use the word all, but most of it is predicated on some adversity, some injury. It serves to propel us, to give us something that we didn't have before. It's not growth in spite of injury. It is growth because of injury. So I think at the personal level, I think at the systems level, sometimes for the best to happen, I'll use an extreme, sometimes the worst has to happen first.
I think that's a very optimistic outlook on maybe some of what's going on right now. And I think that's important. That's an important perspective that people can hold on to. For the individual fears, for the people that are going about their day in this interim period while we're kind of dealing with this injury, like this injury that you're talking about, or this crashing and burning isn't like a one-time thing. Like what we're facing right now is something that is going to play out over the course of the next 4 years and potentially longer than that. How do people begin to wrap their heads around managing fear and maybe catastrophizing and really worrying about their own health, their own well-being, the people around them? Where does the framework come in then?
So again, I'm a phenomenologist. I go back to, I don't know what some of these words mean, so let's try to analyze them in terms of behaviors that I do understand, or at least psychological constructs that I think I understand. The first thing, in the wake of acute adversity, people typically look for a quick fix. And one of those quick fixes, sounds counterintuitive, is finger pointing, blame, which beyond a modicum of educative value, I think is self-defeating, frankly. And I think we're kind of spinning in that process right now. And we'll have to go through, it's just natural, we'll have to go through that. But we look for the quick fix. George Everly doesn't have it. I don't think you have it. And frankly, I can't think of any off the top of my head that has a quick fix. So the first thing we must embrace is the shock, the acute phase. This is going to be a journey. Patience is requisite. Nothing of lasting, enduring quality in human history was done overnight, probably. It was a long process, but we don't like that. We don't like uncertainty. First of all, we don't like change. You remember Virginia Satir, who said people prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. So we get stuck. And now we've got this uncertainty, and it's looking like it's a journey, not a quick fix, which is, you aspire to. So what makes that journey difficult? Because it's one thing for me to say, Lindsay, this is a journey. Let's go on our journey. And you say, George, that seems easier said than done. What's the psychological dynamic? It's that we don't know what's down the road. It's uncertainty. We don't like that uncertainty. Keep coming back to that. Because uncertainty, what's the ultimate underlying construct, is feeling out of control. Now, that I can work with. But I see how many levels I had to go down to figure this out. So if it's ultimately I'm out of control, then all of a sudden, I think any of your listeners can now figure out what the remedy is. It's get back in control. You cannot predict the future, but to some degree, you can create it. I think I was struck by the notion that as difficult as it may seem, as much of a journey as it may seem, requiring patience, if we do not create our own future, we will be forced to endure it. And my sense is the people listening to us now are those people who don't like feeling out of control. They have the capacity to begin to shape their own futures. It's just a matter of getting unstuck.
So I'm going to throw another construct at you, a word that you may not know what it means, and we're going to break it down. What about anger? What do people do with anger?
I view anger as energy. I've dealt a lot with anger in my career. And in people who, when they get angry, can exert significant damage to other people and systems. So I'm studied anger for a long time. Still have a hard time getting my head around it. But if I try to reframe it, I do it two ways, which have worked pretty well for me. I will point out to people that by getting angry, you're actually surrendering control to the people or things that made you angry in the first place. And that statement in and of itself is ludicrous because no one makes you feel angry. You make you feel angry. No one, as I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt said, no one can make you feel bad without your permission. So we're out there giving carte blanche. So the first thing I want people to think about is that they are the more anger they get, the more they surrender control. And then I'll ask them a rhetorical question. Is that really what you want to do? That person, you say, just made you angry. So we'll change it. Say they set up a condition and you made yourself angry. But regardless, you're surrendering control of your life, your well-being, maybe your family's life and well-being to that person who doesn't even know you. And if they know you, they probably don't even like you. So why would you do that? So that's the first step. So then you get people thinking, and that's re-empowering. They'll say, wait a minute, okay, I really do have control over that. Remember Marcus Aurelius in his book Meditations, and I'm Anglicanizing it, so forgive me, I don't do the original Latin. But he said, control what you can, cope with the rest, and remember the only thing you have control over is how you react to the world as it unfolds before you. I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, and to keep in mind that if we do not shape our future, we will be forced to endure it. So the next thing is harness the energy, because anger is energy, and put it in a good place, not a bad place.
I want to ask you one last question. I think the antidote, you said there's no quick fix, but the immediate thing that a lot of people are turning to is just to turn it off, just to shield themselves from the news, from the commentary. Is there value in that?
Yes. Yes. If anger is taking poison and expecting the other person to die, then turning it off could be a welcome respite, as long as that's all it is a respite. Because alienation and retreat and isolation is not conducive to human well-being. And it's certainly not conducive to change.
That is a powerful place to stop. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Everly, for being with us.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.